But tonight we're going to start with Isaac marrying Rebekah. Now last week we left off, this is in Genesis chapter 24 by the way. Last week we left off with Abraham going up the mountain to do what? Sacrifice Isaac. That to us is still hard to understand, hard to identify with, because that's not something we would do. It's certainly not something I would be as agreeable to doing as Abraham was. Now I know whatever God tells us to do, we're supposed to do. But I look at Abraham and think, okay, God told you to go sacrifice your son, and you were up early the next morning to go do it. Like I don't understand that. I can't identify with that level of faith. Maybe that was it. Maybe he just never went to bed the night before. So this is the son that God had promised. Excuse me. My allergies I had a couple weeks ago are back, and I'm trying not to lose my voice again. So he went, this was the child that God had promised him, and yet here God is telling him, now you have to go sacrifice him. We know that Abraham seems to have understood more than what we understand, that he thought God was going to provide a sacrifice. Maybe God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. God was going to do something. He knew that this was not the end of his time with Isaac, and yet he still was being called on to go up the mountain and plunge the dagger in, and it was at that point that God stopped him. Well, now we move forward in time, and this son Isaac is older now. He's an adult, and it comes time for him to get married. And in Genesis chapter 4, we see that Abraham sent his servant Eliezer. Where have we heard that name before in our studies? Eliezer of Damascus.
That's who Abraham thought was going to be there.
Okay, so this is the guy that very good, Marilyn. That is important. That is important because this is the guy who stood to inherit everything as far as Abraham was concerned. And not only does he not inherit everything, but he's got to go now find a bride for the boy who does inherit everything. And that might make most of us a little bitter, right? I was going to be the one that got all of Abraham's stuff, and now it's this punk kid, and I've got to go find him a wife. But we don't see bitterness from Eliezer. We see that he takes this responsibility seriously. And so Eliezer of Damascus was sent to find Isaac a wife from his own tribe. So Eliezer goes back to Haran, to the village of Nahor, where Abraham's family had settled after they left Ur of the Chaldees. They went back to this area that's what we know of as northern Iraq, around the Turkish border area. He goes back to this place to find a wife for Isaac. Now Abraham is insistent in the first 9 verses here. He is insistent that Eliezer goes back to that place to find somebody from his tribe. Why would he do that? Weren't there women in Canaan? What's that?
Isn't that what his mother wanted?
What his mother wanted? Might have been. Abraham makes him swear an oath. He does this thing that is kind of strange to us, where he makes Eliezer put his hand under Abraham's thigh. Basically, he's sitting on his hand. That was some kind of oath that they did. I'm glad we don't do that now anymore, right? That would have been too much closeness for me even before COVID. But he swears this oath. He says, promise me that you will not have him marry a Canaanite woman. What would have been Abraham's objection to marrying a Canaanite woman? Was he just racist? Or was there something else going on here?
Did they not have other gods?
Bingo. They had other gods.
Baal?
Baal. I've recently heard people pronouncing it Baal. The whole time I was growing up here in Oklahoma, it was Baal. So I don't know. Yes, but they had pagan gods. And we know from later stories in the Old Testament that when one of the Israelite men married one of the pagan women, Did the Israelite men convert them to the one true God, or did they?
No, they usually
It was-
got sucked in.
It was always, almost without exception, it was the other way around. King Solomon messed up his whole family because he started bringing in idols into the family. So Abraham already is worried about this. He said, don't let him marry a pagan Canaanite woman. It wasn't because of racism. It was because he didn't want his son worshiping false gods. And so Eliezer traveled to see Abraham's family in Haran. And one evening he arrived there in the village as the women were leaving to draw the water. And as he's watching the women come out of the village to draw the water, he begins to pray. And he asks God to show him a sign. Now, I saw something on Facebook today. I think it was Frank Turek, whose videos we watched several weeks ago. Maybe it was him. It was somebody about apologetics and evidence for the Bible. And people were on there, Christians were on there saying, it's wrong to look for signs. You should just believe. Well, lots of people just believe without looking at the evidence, and they believe wrong things. God has given us evidence. And they quoted that verse. It's a wicked and perverse generation that looks after a sign that I shared with you a few weeks ago talking about the sign of Jonah. God doesn't say we should never look for a sign. God doesn't say we should never look for evidence. When Jesus said it's a wicked and perverse generation, it's because the Pharisees were looking for him to do a magic trick instead of believing the signs he'd already given. So it's not always wrong to ask God, show me. Sometimes he'll show us in his word. Sometimes he'll show us through circumstances. But it's not wrong depending on your motivation. And so Eliezer asked God for a sign. And that sign was, when I ask one of these women for a drink, let me know it's the right one that you've picked for Isaac, because she'll also offer to water my camels. Now to us, we think, what's the big deal? Okay, she's just watering camels. That was a big job. Because camels, they store a lot of water. They can go a long time without drinking. Well, they can do that because they store all that water, but when they're empty, they're empty. And you have to bring jug after jug after jug. So they're having to either haul water up from a creek or pull it up from a well. And jug after jug, she's having to haul water for his camels to get filled up. So this is no small task. So he's looking for a woman that when he says, could I have a drink of your water? She says, of course you may, and let me get some for your camels also. He prayed to God for that sign. Before he had even finished his prayer, there was a young woman named Rebekah who came out to draw water. She gave him water like he requested. He said, could I have a drink? She gave him some. And then she volunteered to draw several pitchers of water for his camels as well. So he begins to talk to her and says, who are you? Who are your people? That sort of thing. He finds out that she's Abraham's grandniece. Abraham's, I'm trying to remember the relationship here. Laban. It's her brother.
Laban was her uncle, because her father was Abraham's brother.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I just drew a blank there all of a sudden.
You sent homework home, I did.
Very good. Very good. I need somebody to read ahead and keep me on my toes. Now, I've told you before, this is the reason I write books on stuff, is because I will forget. She was Abraham's grandniece. And so when he realized there was a relationship here, most of us today, that we would look at that and go, okay, can't be her because of the family relationship. But to him, that was a sign, because in that day and age, you married within the extended family. He realized God had led him to Rebekah. And so there's this long explanation in verses 29 through 51 where he explains to her brother Laban why Abraham had sent him. And on the basis of this, and talking about the prayer and the sign and all that God had done, Laban and the rest of the family decide that a union between Isaac and Rebekah must be God's will. Now, they do ultimately ask her whether she's willing, and she agrees to it. And so they threw a celebration that night, and Rebekah agreed to leave with Eliezer the next morning. It really is a different world when this guy shows up with a bunch of camels and says, your long-lost relative sent me. hey, can your sister go with me? And she says, yeah, I'll go with you tomorrow. I'll never see my family again, but let's just get in the caravan and go. Totally different world. So she agreed to leave the next morning. This is after the family decides to try to stall things. Let her stay for a while, at least 10 days. Because they thought, this is great. This is a sign from God. We want her to go and have this life that God has for her, but we're not ready yet. And so they go back and forth. Laban and Eliezer, they argue about it. And finally Laban says, well, let's ask Rebekah what she wants to do. And she says, I'm going to go with him. And so they leave that morning. They travel back to Canaan. Their caravan arrives in the evening while Isaac is out praying in the fields. He probably doesn't know that Rebekah is close by. He probably doesn't know the caravan's approaching, but he's out praying in the fields. She sees him. She asks Eliezer, who's that? He tells her, that's Isaac. That's your husband-to-be. She sees him. She jumps off the camel. She puts a veil around her face as a sign of modesty and runs to him. And it says that they were married and they loved each other, which is not always the way things worked out in these arranged marriages, but they were very happy with what God had designed. So I've already skipped ahead here and asked you one of my questions. Why was it so important to Abraham that Isaac marry a girl from the old country? It's because he didn't want his son being led astray after the false gods. What kind of example does Eliezer provide to us? If you look at it, and we may need to look at some of the text here to see this, but you can see look at verses 12 through 14, for example. He says, it says here, then he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success this day and show kindness to my master Abraham. Behold, here I stand by the well of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now let it be that the young woman to whom I say, please let down your pitcher that I may drink, and she says, drink, and I will also give your camels a drink. Let her be the one that you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So he prays, and he is he's determined to seek God's will at every turn in this story. What can we learn from his example?
He was not only loyal to his master, he was loyal to God.
Okay.
He was taught about God in that household.
Mm-hmm.
If you need to do a job, you need to pray about it.
Okay.
And get God's direction in doing it, and it'll come out right.
Yeah. For those watching at home, Jimmy Ann said that he was loyal to Abraham and he was loyal to God because he had learned about God in that household. And Bob said when you've got a job that you need done right, you pray about it. Both of those are true, by the way. Anything else? Anything else that we can learn from his example?
We learned that God answers prayer.
Okay.
And he does it immediately sometimes, or he does it slow.
He did then.
Yeah. God answers prayer sometimes immediately, not always though, right? He seems to genuinely care about what he's been sent to do. He's not just doing it for the paycheck. As I said earlier, I think I might harbor a little bit of resentment toward Isaac and maybe toward Abraham about losing out on all that inheritance. But he seems to genuinely be concerned for the good of the people that he's serving. I think there's a lesson in there for us as well that it's important to do what's right, but it's also important to do it for the right reasons. So let me ask you this. Why do you think that Eliezer asked God for the specific sign he did? Why was watering the camels important?
It went beyond what was normal hospitality.
Okay.
So by watering the camels, Rebekah was showing her character to be more of a kind person than the usual.
Very good. I think that's right. Yeah, she was showing what kind of person she was. That she was kind. She was willing to go the extra mile, willing to serve. Benjamin, look for that kind of woman, okay? Doesn't matter. Yeah, who likes to water camels? Doesn't matter how all the makeup looks. Doesn't matter how much money she comes with. Look for a nice woman, and you'll be happy. All right.
Rebekah was beautiful,
She was beautiful. Yes. Yes.
so that's okay.
And you can find somebody that comes with all of the above. All right. But look for a nice woman. As a matter of fact, King Solomon said you're better off being alone than being with a mean woman. So, and of course, ladies better off being alone than being with a mean man also.
Amen.
Of all the things I thought might get an amen tonight, that was not it. All right. Yeah, I think he could have said, he could have asked for any number of signs. He could have said, Lord, I don't know, send a flashing neon billboard behind her and can dancers to line the. They didn't know about those things, but he could have done that, and God could have answered with any sign he wanted. But he knew what kind of person he was looking for, and that's the kind of sign that he asked for. So how does this story contribute anything to the overall story of the Bible? Because that's what we're doing here. We're not just trying to learn Bible stories, but how they fit together on the road to the death, burial, and resurrection. How does this move us along? How does this tell us anything about God and his plans?
Through Isaac, Abraham's going to have more descendants.
Okay.
And he's not going to do that, regardless of what they say today. He's not going to do that unless he has a wife.
Okay. Yeah. God has promised that through this bloodline, he's hinted at this point that through this bloodline, he's going to bring the Messiah into the world. Eventually, he clarifies that into a promise that they will understand. But without Rebekah, there is no bloodline. So
God has a plan, and even though we might not understand it or know what it is, he's working through these people to accomplish that plan.
yeah, yes, he is always working his plan, and even as dysfunctional as this group is from time to time. We've talked about some of the stuff with Abraham. I'm trying to remember. I think Isaac and Rebekah were fairly normal, although maybe not the greatest parents in the world. But their sons, I've told you before, if they had the Jerry Springer show in the second millennium BC, they would have been on it. But God can work and fulfill his plans even through people we would least expect. All right, that brings us to Genesis 25 and the birth of Jacob and Esau, who are their sons. So we've moved about 20 years forward just in this chapter, and we're just going to look at a few verses here, starting in the story starts in verse 20 that we're going to look at. Isaac and Rebekah discovered that she was barren. That's the word the Bible uses. That means she struggled with infertility. Isaac prayed hard for his wife. There were two things that determined how successful you were in the ancient world, in their world. How many animals you had, and how many, what else? Children. Okay. So if she was 20 years in to their marriage and had not produced any children yet, how is she feeling?
Like Sarah did earlier.
Like Sarah did earlier? Probably feels like a failure, probably feels like less of a woman. Now, we know those things are not true, but it's probably how she felt. And so Isaac, as somebody who loved his wife, this wasn't just a marriage of convenience, he loved her, he was praying for her. Now, I think there's a lesson in there for us, men. If you love your wife, Be concerned about the things that bother her. And don't just try to fix them, but take them to God. Be on your knees for her. So he's praying for his wife. He's begging God to enable her to conceive. And we see that God eventually heard Isaac's prayer, and he enabled Rebekah to become pregnant, not just with one child, but with two. There were twins. And as the pregnancy progressed, Rebekah could feel the babies struggling against each other. Now, it's been weird to me that how much you can know about a baby's personality before they're born. And that's not even me carrying the babies, okay? But I've kind of had a glimpse just from feeling them and seeing what they react to and what sounds they react to. Had a glimpse of the personalities of all four of the children that are born, and it's pretty close to who they turned out to be. She could feel these babies in there, and they were fighting. Maybe not what we would think of as fighting, but they were struggling for room. They were pushing each other. And so she asked God why this was taking place. And so God speaks to her in verse 23. God speaks to her in verse 23, if I can get there. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So God reveals to her that there's this great ongoing struggle. It's not just the babies pushing each other for room. There's an ongoing struggle that has begun right here and is eventually going to spill out and engulf entire countries. He said that there was going to be a stormy relationship between the brothers and their descendants, and they were going to be the sources of 2 warring nations. So when the time came for them to be born, Esau came first. He was darker complected and had quite a bit of hair. He grows up to be a rugged outdoorsman, and he kind of looked like it from the very beginning. But Jacob was noticeably frailer than Esau. He was a little more delicate than his brother, but he was born grasping his older brother's heel. Now that's an unusual detail to include. Okay, babies will reach out and excuse me, folks. If the Bible records it, I believe it happened. I'm just saying it's unusual. They'll reach out, but you don't really think of them gripping things. But in some way, shape, or form, he was following his brother out of the womb. Esau was not getting out of there without Jacob literally nipping at his heels. Okay? And this is the start of the rivalry between Jacob and Esau. Now, those of you who've done any Bible study on your own, how was the prophecy of the 2 brothers in verse 23? How was that fulfilled?
Esau should have had the birthright because he was older,
Okay?
but he got old and weak and wanted Jacob to feed him.
Mm-hmm.
Because Esau had always provided the meat and Jacob would make the stews.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacob had told him then, if you want to eat, you got to sell me your birthright.
Mm-hmm.
So that made the older serve the younger.
Yep. The Jacob, and we're going to talk about this, and we'll talk about one of these stories tonight. Well, if we have time, it's on my list for tonight. Esau ends up giving away his birthright and his blessing, or being tricked out of them, and so ends up serving his brother. They end up. Jacob ends up having to run for his life. But Jacob was the ancestor of what group of people?
Jacob,
Yeah, Jacob was the ancestor of what group of people?
the Israelites.
The Israelites. Esau was the ancestor of what group of people? Do you know?
Edomites.
The Edomites. As a matter of fact, the name Edom means red and comes from the physical description of Esau. The Edomites and the Israelites were at war with each other, and eventually the Edomites were defeated by the Israelites and forced to serve them. So it was not only true within the family, it was true within the nations. God's prophecy came to be fulfilled. Now, how does this story move us along? How does this contribute to the overall story of the Bible?
Jacob ran from Esau, and he ended up, seeing the Lord.
Okay? He did.
As he traveled to and from land that he went to.
Okay.
Well, back in verse 23, the Lord spoke to Rebekah and made some predictions, and all of those predictions came true.
Right. And all of those predictions that he made did contribute to the position that Israel was in for God to use them to bring the Messiah into the world. But that fight between the Israelites and the Edomites also threatened Israel's position, and that comes up several times throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Maybe a better way to ask this question, I'll try to remember it this way next time. A better way to ask this question may be, why is it important that this is in the Bible? If it's in there, we know it's important, but why is this important to the overall story?
What's happening now over there?
Okay? Yeah. A lot of the conflicts that are taking place there now, also another reason why it's important is because a lot of the conflicts that are there now, and will be there until Jesus comes again, started here in the book of Genesis. All right, I think we have time for one more, maybe two more. Genesis chapter 26. This is just a few years. We don't know exactly where this falls, so actually we'll come back to Genesis 25 for the next story, because I think that's the way this probably happened, but I could be wrong. Genesis chapter 26. If you've not heard this story before, you may want to go look it up, because you may think, he's making that up, that this happened again. There was another famine that took place in the land of Canaan. And God warned Isaac not to seek relief in Egypt. He said, stay here in Canaan. I will take care of you. I will. And he begins to make some of the same promises to Isaac that he made to Abraham, as far as blessing his family, giving him numerous descendants. So he said, don't go to Egypt, stay here in Canaan. So instead of going to Egypt, Isaac journeyed to the land of Gerar, where our friends the Philistines live, and where his father had traveled years before. Now the Philistines who lived there expressed an interest in Rebekah. Stop me if you've heard the story before.
Yeah. She's my sister.
This is the third time something like this has happened in the book of Genesis. I do not understand this at all. Jimmy Ann, add this to the book. Add this to the book. I don't want to ask God. I want to ask Abraham and Isaac. What were y'all doing? Explain this to me.
Okay, I'll put it in my book.
If you're new with us, Jimmy Ann is keeping a list of, she's making a book of things we want to remember to ask when we get to heaven. So the Philistines, excuse me, the Philistines who lived in Gerar expressed an interest in Rebekah. Isaac followed Abraham's example. Benjamin, there's a partial bottle of water in that side office. Would you go grab it for me, please? Followed Abraham's example, and instead of trusting God to take care of him, he lied, and he claimed that Rebekah was his sister out of fear that the Philistines would kill him to get to her. He said, wait a minute, if I say this girl is my wife, they're going to kill me so that now she's free. So I'll say she's my sister. Now in Abraham's case, we can, as awful as it is, we can look at it and say, well, it was half true. She was his half-sister and his wife. He just left part of it out. He and Rebekah were cousins. Like second cousins, once removed maybe, something like that.
Yeah.
I need to sit down and do the math. So he's just out and out lying at this point, saying she's my sister. And so the Philistines kind of, they kind of back off, but they're still watching Rebekah. Thank you, buddy. They're watching Rebekah because they're interested in her. Abimelech of Gerar. Have we heard that name before? All right. He's the same one that Abraham pulled this nonsense with. he's a little suspicious about these Israelites, or they weren't called Israelites then, but about this family that shows up with a sister. And so he's watching them one day. He sees them out the window, and I'd have Charla come up here, but she won't. He caresses her. The Bible describes it as caressing. I don't know exactly what it means. They were hugging or pitch and woo. No, we're not doing that on camera. We'll put it in the Okie translation, say they were pitch and woo, and he saw them. And he called in Isaac and said, "Who is she really? Because that's not your sister." Come on, man, that's not your sister. "Well, yeah, that's my wife." He figured it out. And he confronted Isaac. He was upset that Isaac had lied. Isaac said he lied because he was afraid. "Man, why would you tell us this? You told us that she was your sister. Somebody could have taken her off into their harem and could have caused all kinds of trouble for our country. We've already been through this with you people, with this family once before. Why do you keep doing this to us?" He was angry because he said, basically, we've dealt with your God before. We've tangled with your God told me I was a dead man last time. He said, and here you are again about to invite judgment, God's judgment on the whole kingdom. Yet, Abimelech was too afraid of God to punish Isaac. He was so angry at Isaac, but he was too afraid to punish him because he was afraid of Isaac's God. And so he said, nobody can harm Isaac or Rebekah during their stay in Gerar. You know what? I've been asking my questions, and I'll come back to my questions in just a minute, but do y'all have any questions? You normally will chime in, but you've been kind of quiet tonight. Do you have any questions about any of the stories that we've talked about so far? Kids, do y'all have any questions? I'm taking a big risk here on camera, but I want to make sure you feel free to ask them if you've got them. You look like you've got a question. Okay. I'll come back to you in a minute, okay? So God promised here that he was going to bless Isaac if he kept his family in Canaan. He tells him that in verses 2 through 5. Sometimes God sent him to Canaan, or told him to stay in Canaan. Sometimes God sent him to Egypt. Why does God change what am I trying to ask here? Why do you think God doesn't pick one or the other?
Just make sure you're listening.
That's a very real possibility. Make sure they're listening. And I'm actually asking. I'm not trying to get to a certain answer here. I have a thought, but I don't know that I'm right. That just popped out to me yesterday. Why in the world would God go back and forth between whether he's going to send them to Canaan or send them to Egypt or leave them where they are?
Could be the situation at that place at that moment in time, too.
Could be. The situation was different.
Yeah.
Maybe in one circumstance it was safer in Egypt than in Canaan or vice versa.
I wanted to see if they'd obey and go into this place.
Okay, God wanted to see if they'd obey. Anybody else? The thought I had, and I don't know if it's right or not, is that if he sent them to Egypt every time, then their trust would be in Egypt instead of him. You know what? It could be all of these. It could be none of these. It could be all of these and then some. Just wondered what your thoughts were. Okay, here's my big question. Why in the world did Isaac follow his father's example and lie to his host?
Because it worked.
Okay, it worked. How, in what way did it work?
Okay, they didn't kill Abraham to get to Sarah.
Didn't kill him.
They gave Sarah back to him.
Gave Sarah
and
back.
paid him to take her back.
Sorry, they gave Sarah back and paid him to take her back.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean,
I wonder if that was a common practice
It's possible. I hadn't thought about that. That maybe that was a common thing in the ancient world to throw your wife under the bus and pretend and pretend she's my sister. Here, take my wife, take my sister, but leave me alone. Yeah, that maybe it was.
Well, it's like Christy said, a lot of those people thought his wives as being property,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Maybe he was just going along with the.
Not necessarily Isaac, but the people that he was talking to.
Yeah. Maybe he was just going along with the culture that treated them as Yeah, because I don't get the sense that Abraham or Isaac viewed their wives as property, although they acted like it on occasion. And ladies, if you're... We know it happened once with Rebekah. We know it happened at least twice with Sarah. If you're Sarah, how excited are you to go back to that guy after he threw you under the bus to the pagans the second time? Like, should I ask what you said?
I said they probably didn't have property division then.
Probably not, yeah. Was the payment to get him to, when they paid him, said, here, I'm going to give you this money, you take her back, was that to pay him off to take the risk because she's going to straight up kill him when they get in the caravan?
They,
Wow.
they wanted to do anything, and let your God take you away from here, and take whatever you need, and some.
Yeah.
We don't want to have any appearance of guilt in this deal.
Yeah. Well,
Also,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. The promises were made to Abraham
Mhm.
and then to his sons
Yes.
through the male heirs. And so maybe Sarah and Rebekah thought, if I'm going to reap the benefits of God's promise, I need to stay with one man.
Right. Well, and I know realistically, what Tommy said, there wasn't property division. Women couldn't just go divorce their husband. So I know they didn't really have an option. I just thought, I can't imagine I'd be too excited to go back with them. They could still get mad, yes. Wait, women can get mad? I've never experienced that.
The lady who spoke her mind,
Yes.
that Abraham got married for.
Yes, he did.
Some sleepless nights.
Yes. Well, we know that from Scripture that she spoke her mind because Abraham just gets to the point where with Hagar, he tells Sarah, do whatever you want. And I've been there. I'm just, sometimes things just slip out, sorry. No. Oh, no, she'd probably say the same thing. But I think all of it, men and women, we've probably all been in that situation where, okay, just do what you want. And that's where Abraham was at that point, because Sarah was probably not a shrinking violet. So why is it important that this story's in the Scriptures? What can we learn from it that would be a reason why God would put it in here?
That God's will is to be done, no matter what you do.
Okay.
You know, he's gonna keep it going until he gets to where he wants it to be.
Okay, God's will is going to be done. We can mess up our part in God's plan, but we really can't mess up His overall plan. That's good. Yes, sir.
We can trust him?
We can trust Him. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because regardless of what we think about Isaac for doing what he did stay in Canaan, and God did take care of him. God protected him, and God provided, and it was through this circumstance. So,
I'm also saying that because he shouldn't have pretended that it was his sister. He should have relied on God and still said it was his wife.
right. Yeah, he should have trusted God more, but even when he wasn't faithful, God still was, right? Good. That's good.
God kept his promise no matter what he did.
Yeah. And I'm thankful God keeps His promises even when we fall short.